Houghton, Michigan is in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and it gets about 300 inches of snow every year. It's a very snowy place. And that was important because my father was a physics professor specializing in lattice and crystalline structures, and specifically with applications to the properties of snow. And so one of the world's top snow research facilities is at Michigan Technological University in Houghton, Michigan. And my mother was a chemistry professor. And so I just want you to imagine, the hardcore Asian family in Upper Michigan with a physics professor for a dad and a chemistry professor for a mom. And so there was never a doubt that I was going to become a scientist. It was just, it was more than genetic. I unfortunately disappointed my parents to some extent by encountering, while I was an undergraduate, the work of one of our Turing winners, Dana Scott. And at the time that I ran into this research, of course this was in the 1970s, but the work that Dana had done was going back a decade before then, was relatively unknown in the US. It was really known much more in Europe at the time. But it was computer science. And in the context of my upbringing, computer science was not really a legitimate intellectual pursuit. The real pursuits of value, of true legitimacy, were in the physical sciences. But Dana really changed that for me. I was always attracted to computer science before I met Dana Scott's work. It was something where I was the typical high school kid, who just loved writing computer programs and was really learning a lot. But it could never enter my mind that this was something that I could choose as a vocation until I read Dana's work. What happened is I went to college at the University of Michigan. I started off in physics. After I got into thermodynamics, I decided physics wasn't for me, and I made my first disappointment to my parents by switching to math. So I became a math major. And so I had a very strong math bias. And so even I had come to believe that there wasn't really anything special about computer science. Computer science was just a form of mathematics, nothing more. And so, of course, all of you here are computer scientists, so you immediately see this and think, computer program. But that wasn't true in 1977. This is an equation, and it's a math problem, obviously, that's being posed to a person. Solve for f. And it doesn't take too long to think about this and realize that if we are given God's factorial function and plug that in for f, then the equation holds. Okay, and so no big deal. There's nothing to computer science really that would merit, certainly not graduate study, and certainly nothing scientific about it. But what was interesting in the early 1960s about Dana Scott's work were thought experiments, and very interesting thought experiments that raised paradoxes. And one that I use here is this. And again, as a computer scientist, you all can see clearly and instantly that this is a program that is not the same program as the first one. But the mathematics of the time, pre-Dana Scott, could not account for this. God's factorial function solves both equations. And so for me, there was just this flash of insight that, oh my God, there is something new and different in computing. That accounting for and understanding computation, and in this case what Dana called computable functions, was a legitimately new discipline in the pursuit of knowledge. And for me, it made it then possible for me to decide to go into graduate school to study computer science. So this all, I know, comes across as a little pretentious, but what I'm trying to go over the top on a little bit here is this idea of operating a little bit with a chip on your shoulders. And part of being a CI fellow is not just doing great research, but also carrying forward some ideas and principles about how to conduct yourselves as members of a research community. In this situation, you will find that you will be challenged over and over again in your commitment to what's really true and good about basic research. And in those challenges, it will always be tempting to, as I did, to not think that something is legitimate or not think that something is not true. And so you have to find ways to keep an open mind and constantly explore. In this situation, of course, I did end up writing a PhD thesis that was just one small contribution to a broader field of formal program analysis. And of course, years later, I ended up being very satisfied about the impact of that work. However, after I wrote my PhD thesis in this area, I was hired by Nico Haberman and Dana Scott at Carnegie Mellon, and that was a great thing for me. And I was doing work in this fairly theoretical, because we live in a society now that increasingly struggles to understand and sometimes even tolerate the investment in basic research. And so part of being a CI fellow is to be part of the vanguard of our research community that keeps those principles alive and keeps propagating them forward. And in this case, as I mentioned before, it has been tremendously satisfying. I eventually did migrate to Microsoft Research, where I work now. And it's just, I can't tell you how satisfying it is to walk into a data center and see a gigantic machine doing formal program analysis. There's been a series of National Academy studies called the Tire Track Studies. Ed Lazowska was the author of one of them. And they're called Tire Track Studies because they have this diagram which looks vaguely like tire tracks that shows how investments in basic research by the US government have eventually contributed to the emergence of new industries, multi-billion-dollar industries. And it's very interesting to trace some of the twists and turns and struggles and challenges through this. So now, second thing I want to say is has to do with mentorship. And one thing that I think is a misconception about mentors and mentorship is that is the idea that you need a mentor when you're young and when you're new in your career. And one thing I think that I'd like to say is, yes, that's true, but mentorship is something that has to be a lifelong or career-long activity, both on the receiving end and on the giving end. And so I don't mean to embarrass Ed too much, but one of my mentors late in my career has been Ed Lazowska. And when I say mentoring, I mean not just giving advice, although I do get a lot of advice from Ed. Yeah, most of it's solicited. And I also do get a lot of encouragement and moral support. But I also get homework from Ed. And so as you think about your role as a mentoree, the things that you want in the relationship, you want, I think, ideally to be active. And as you develop into a mentor and as you mentor other people, think about how to make that relationship very active. To put a fine point on it here, one piece of homework that Ed gave me, this was back in 2008, and a new president was elected. And unfortunately, one of Ed's close friends, Tom Khalil, was appointed a policy director for technology policy. And so, of course, the new administration had to come up with ideas about what to do, and so Tom asked Ed to round up a bunch of ideas in the form of 2-page white papers. And then the reason that's unfortunate is then Ed then asked me to write one of those about DARPA. And so I did write that. And that ended up being this white paper, Re-envisioning DARPA. I'm not tremendously proud of the white paper now that I read it, but at the time it was an important exercise. I ended up getting help from Randy Katz, which was tremendous, because Randy, unlike me, had actually spent time working at DARPA and had a lot of valuable insights. But the thing that happened is then a few weeks later, Tom Khalil and the new presidential appointee as the director of DARPA, who was a good friend of mine, Regina Dugan, called me up saying, Peter, you have to go to DARPA. And I say, well, I can't do that. I'm just 2 years into being a department head at Carnegie Mellon. You know, I have a kid in middle school. I can't do that. And of course, Tom was just mercilessly shoving this white paper back at me, and really left me with no choice but to go. And so there was and this was the result of a kind of mentoring that maybe was overly painful. This is a little bit extreme, and I wouldn't want this to happen to me again. But it is something that actually helped me to grow tremendously, really opened some horizons, really stretched me in many different ways, and gave me some new insights, and I think made me ultimately a better person. At DARPA, I mentioned, I worked for the director, Regina Dugan, and this is something, then the third thing I'd like to say, which has to do with being uncomfortable. And I know, again, it's kind of trite to be outside the comfort zone, but there is something to that. Regina Dugan is someone who I dearly love, and she's just really an amazing person, but she is also one of the most difficult people, not just to work with, but just to be with. Just incredibly hard. We're very, very close friends, and in a previous incarnation, we must have been married. It's just very, but she never does anything the right way or the easy way. And so I finally agree to go to DARPA to help her out, and it says, that's great. So tomorrow, Secretary Gates is coming to DARPA. I need you to come here and talk to him for 10 minutes and tell him what you're going to do. I mean, how nutty is that? First of all, how much trust, crazy trust, did Regina have in me to do that? But it's just nuts. And so I drive down to DARPA from Pittsburgh, just really distracted, trying to think of what to do, what to say, what could I possibly say? And I cross into Maryland and get pulled over for a speeding ticket. And it's sort of a crummy thing. As it turned out, on that day, I was supposed to have lunch with the CRA staff, and Kapil Petnik and Peter Harsha were at that lunch, or I don't know if you guys joined the lunch, right? And we go out to lunch, and I talk about, because I'm going to see Secretary Gates later, and they show me, I talk about this speeding ticket, and I think Peter and Kapil say, no problem, you should download this app, which is Trapster. And Trapster has been sort of overtaken by Waze and a few other apps now. But at the time, Trapster was the thing. And actually, I used it extensively in my commutes between Pittsburgh and Arlington. And at the end, I was able to make that commute in 3 hours and 25 minutes, which is really fast. So now, so the thing here is, I really had nothing to say to Secretary Gates. I didn't know what was going on at DARPA. I didn't have any time to think about it. And so in that flash, I decided I was going to take Trapster in to talk to Secretary Gates. And it was actually hard because I had, on like an hour's notice, had to find a way to bring an iPhone into DARPA, which was not, at that time, wasn't easy. And so the idea was to talk about the convergence of exponential trends, the kind of exponential growth in the ubiquity of mobile internet, of access to cloud services like mapping, to social media, and that all of these things converging together provided a powerful tool that allowed me to defeat the Maryland State Police. Okay, and this was basically the crux of the conversation that I had. I also then had a second thing, which is very similar. There was a website made by a grad student called North Korea Uncovered, which was another kind of crowdsourcing site. But these two ideas ended up being fundamental in the formation of a new technology office at DARPA, and also helped really inform the DoD leadership about what these growing trends in social media and networks, in cloud computing, in mobile wireless, what they might mean for national defense. And many of the ideas did have a deep influence in the thinking of people on the ground in Afghanistan just a couple of years later. Now, I did have a chance then to talk in more formal settings in DARPA in my first month there, and I opted, Regina very kindly gave me the option to either take on one of the existing big tech offices or start a new one. And I thought starting a new one might be hard, but was a very rare opportunity, so I ended up doing that. And I also wanted the clear runway to try to rebuild some basic computer science research at DARPA. And so one of the fundamental things I had to do was try to explain to the DARPA and DoD leadership why computer science. And so I gave a short pitch that started with this image. And so why this image? Well, I arrived at DARPA in 2009, and 2009 was the 40th anniversary of the landing on the moon. So this image of Neil Armstrong. And that was a big deal at DARPA in 2009 because ARPA order number 1, turns out, pertained to some of the booster technology that is deployed in the Saturn V booster that helped get these men to the moon. Also, in 1969, and therefore also being celebrated at DARPA when I was there at the same time, was this work on the early ARPANET. And so the first 2 nodes were connected in 1969 and then later expanded to 2 additional nodes. And with that early ARPANET, there was this famous mother of all demos that involved this very homespun mouse and Doug Engelbart's mother of all demos, showing the idea that a network might be more than just a robust and reliable communications network, but might actually augment human intellect. And the demonstration in this case showed the ability for people who are far apart from each other to collaborate productively on the construction of a document. Things that we take for granted now, but at the time were really visionary, and visionary particularly in the context of this sort of military infrastructure. And so with this, there's this somewhat silly question, but for a military general it kind of works, which is to ask, of these 2 amazing accomplishments in science and technology in 1969, which one had more impact? And again, it is silly. I remember I was a 9-year-old kid watching the moon landings, and I think that also contributed to me wanting to go into research. And that's probably true for many of your parents if they're also involved in this. But the answer I gave here, and this was an outgrowth of a discussion with Pat Lincoln, who's at SRI, was to ask this question. And it's a little bit rhetorical. By the way, this is an early picture of Pat Lincoln's daughter. And so that's the... and the point here is that there is this incredible democratization of computing technology that just enables so many people in the world to have access to incredibly powerful tools. And when that happens, you can count on a steady flow of disruptive advances. And so this was the fundamental thing. I was a little more trite than that when I first presented this. I said, my son has never reinforced his math homework using Saturn V booster technology. He's never, and then I also said, unfortunately, he's never downloaded porn behind my back using lunar lander technology. There is the kind of good and bad of any powerful technology, but these sorts of things are important. Now, I show you all of this because, again, I was just at Carnegie Mellon. I was really very, very focused research professor and department head. And so the journey from there over a space of just a few weeks to talking in these terms was incredibly uncomfortable. I never really had clear confidence that what I was saying was appropriate or correct or true. But I was trying to accomplish something greater here in order to really get people to understand why is it that what we do is so important. And that was an incredibly uncomfortable experience. And so again, as people who we've identified as being on the vanguard of our field, the future of our field, being able to live with and accept that kind of discomfort from time to time, I think is going to be something that you'll all face, and I hope you'll all embrace that. And so being outside the comfort zone, I think, is something that, again, when I lived in Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette every year in the sports page has a special issue called the Trite Trophy Awards, because in sports there's always trite sayings like living outside the comfort zone, so maybe I'll win one this year. Okay. All right, so now I'd like to get to Microsoft Research because I think I should have a chance to say a little bit about what we do, and it'll get to another message, and then I can take some questions. And I'm not going to talk about my work now. I'm going to talk about work that goes on in our labs. And this is a story I've told for the last maybe 2 years, and so some of you might have seen it. But I think it's a fairly tidy one that will make the right points. So this is a fairly famous photograph from the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. And I show this picture because it shows the remarkable ability of people to do adaptive beamforming. So in this pandemonium, just imagine all of the noise in the room, machines whirring and bells ringing and people shouting like crazy. And in that room, if you want to converse with someone, you're able to do it. And if you actually study your people closely, you'll see that they reflexively kind of cock their heads a little bit in order to change the time of flight of a person's voice to the 2 ears. And then your mind is able to do the appropriate processing in order to tune out everything else and focus your hearing where you want it to go. It's an amazing, amazing thing. And in the early to mid-1990s, there is quite a bit of academic research trying to understand that both as a cognitive, biological, as well as computational process. And some of that research was going on at Microsoft Research at that time. And so one of the primary papers out of MSR at the time was by Ivan Tashev. And Ivan, as is true for almost everything that MSR does, was collaborating with two professors. And so this paper, which you can see was published in a bioengineering journal, was the first work out of MSR. It wasn't the seminal work in this field, but it was a significant contribution to our understanding of the processes that the human brain goes through to kind of tune out kind of distracting noises. This is the so-called cocktail party conversation problem. Now, the kind of cool thing here, and this is what, when I talk to like Steve Ballmer or now Satya Nadella, I refer to this as blue sky research. So this is research with without any obvious direct relevance to any business imperative of Microsoft. It's really curiosity-driven, just trying to understand something new. And it's openly published. So then a cool thing that happens is that, and this is a great thing about computer science, is that we can actually implement our ideas. So having an understanding of these MVDR adaptive beamformers, you can reduce that to an algorithm and actually build, in this case, a 9-microphone rig attached to a computer that actually does this adaptive beamforming. And so this is a rig that Ivan had developed. And this got shown in lots of academic conferences. And actually, he went to the trouble of testing this in about 400 homes in the Seattle area. And so what it's able to do is you can point it, you set it down, and then you can, in software, point the array at any point in space in the room. And no matter how much noise is in the room, it's going to pick out the signal there. And I won't play the demo for you here. I'll flash through that. But it's quite an amazing piece of work. Very, very interesting. So now, years later, a product designer in Microsoft sees this, says, oh, I have a use for that. But it has to be cheaper. I have a total manufacturing budget of 30 cents for this thing. Okay. Oh, and 9 microphones, it's going to be too complicated to manufacture. Can you reduce it to 4? Oh, and this button you have to push before you can talk. No, this thing has to just stay on because people leave their things on all day, every day, and it just has to stay on, listening all the time and never drifting. Oh, and the thing about that big rig, it emits, when you set it in someone's home, it emits this loud, shrieking kind of wail, getting the reflective properties of the room and calibrating itself. And so he said, don't do that. No calibration. Or if it's calibration, how about some nice music? And so when you, as a researcher, look at all of these things, it all ends up being completely impractical. There's no way to do all these things. And so this is where there's, again, a lot of discomfort because people are going back and forth trying to figure out how to please each other. And normally it fails, but every once in a while it succeeds. And in this case, in the Xbox Connect, people don't realize this, but there is a 4-element microphone array beamforming. It isn't able to zero in on a point, but on any vertical plane in the room, it's able to focus its hearing. And so if you have a Connect and you're watching TV and you wave your hand, that microphone array will snap to the plane that intersects your mouth. And no matter how loud your sound system is or how many people are shouting and talking, it's able to hear you in a normal tone of voice. And so it's an amazing thing to go from there all the way, from cocktail party conversation problem and bioengineering journals all the way to a technology like this. And so there is just incredible joy in those surprising outcomes. So it's something I think that we all want to seek and celebrate. I mentioned MSR, we publish things openly all the time. We actually published the work on this about 8 months before the product was shipped. Of course, we never mentioned Xbox or Connect in the paper, so it's just the pure technical foundations of it. This paper is particularly interesting because it was rejected for publication prior to the launch of the product. And the reviews were really brutal. Basically, no one believed this thing could work. The fact that it was actually, that we were making millions of them right at that very moment in a factory in Shenzhen, China, was sort of beside the point. But there is this sort of, again, this really thin line between a visionary idea and science fiction. And so another thing that you will have to struggle with throughout your careers is just finding that right line. And something I'd like to say is that generally speaking, all of us, myself included, tend to err too much on the conservative and cautious side. And so it's a very, very hard thing. It's an incredibly hard thing. Ivan did not really want to do the work on that cheaper 4-element microphone array. And he probably was right. It probably was clearly science fiction. And honestly, we don't fully understand why it works. If you actually run the physics, it should not be working as well as it is. And so, of course, most of the time, and I saw this at DARPA all the time, ideas that seem wacky, we play it out for a few months, and yes, they were really stupid. But every once in a while, something really great happens. And the tendency outside of DARPA, to my observation, tended to be overly conservative. And so again, as the vanguard, being part of CI Fellows, is compare yourselves and the decisions you make to the people around you. Remember who you are. And if you think you're being more conservative or just as conservative as everyone, maybe it's a good hint to rethink a little bit, push a little bit harder. Another thing that then I'd like to say is just to never lose sight of the fact that research is a long game. Yes, we always want to have great things to brag about, and you all do. But we also have to remember that the one thing that we do that no place else in our society can do is to really invest and go for it for the long term. And to really keep the faith alive in our society that by doing that, we will eventually have some good outcomes that really help people. The idea that breakthrough in 2010 in speech recognition came out of a conversation between Jeff Hinton, who at that time was at the University of Toronto, and we had 2 or 3 of Jeff's students spending the summer with us at Microsoft Research, and Jeff spent about a month with us, and he started talking to 2 of our top speech researchers, Dong Yu and Li Deng, and proposed the idea of using deep neural networks, cascaded or layered neural networks, for speech recognition. And in 2009, I can't emphasize enough what a ridiculous idea that was. Are there speech researchers here? I don't know if there are. It really was something that could not be taken seriously. And so one thing I am very proud of is that MSR initially was not willing to devote too much to this, but it did allow Li Deng and Dong Yu to explore the idea and to sponsor a workshop at NIPS to try to generate more interest. And then MSR did actually spend engineering resources to build the first prototype of a speech recognizer based on deep neural nets. And once we saw the results of that, everything changed. I think within 6 months after that, not just Microsoft, but IBM, Nuance, and Google all switched over to this. So things can change very quickly, and it's thrilling when that happens, but it's a long game. Now, the reason I wanted to show you this is that I started working at MSR in 2010. This started at MSR in 2009, and when I go back in time and put myself in MSR as king of the world there, I think I would have been sorely tempted to kill this project. I knew Jeff Hinton as a professor when he was at Carnegie Mellon back in 1987 to 89 to 1990. My thought would have been, wait a minute, people are still thinking about neural nets? Everyone knows Gaussian mixture models are the right approach. And so the struggles there are very interesting. And Li Deng and Dong Yu had to be experiencing a great deal of discomfort. And so as you get and rise in your careers and you have more of a say in what other people do, maybe the most important thing I've learned is to avoid allowing your own technical prejudices and biases to get in the way. Over and over again, maybe the biggest thing I've learned in my career is that I'm always wrong. Okay? But if I focus just on people who have a track record and who seem to be showing really true and genuine passion and commitment to an idea, even if I think it's stupid, So if Ed Lazowska comes to me and says he's now going to devote his life to getting cabbages to grow faster, I think I will think maybe he's suffering from Alzheimer's, but I will still force myself to make a bet on it because the track record and the commitment and the passion is what matters more than your own technical prejudice or bias. And so if those come into conflict, choose the person, not the idea. In a company, for senior management, the research is about producing two things. One is meaningful kind of technologies or solutions to hard problems that make a difference. And the second is conveying an aura of innovation around the company. And in a company, you want to convey the aura of innovation while not appearing to steal too much credit from the brands, the technical brand names, like in our case, like Bing or Windows or something like that, or Skype. So those are kind of the two things. And so those are both what I would call kind of home run activities. And so, and I felt this situation is very similar at DARPA, where the senior leadership didn't have to know or understand everything that was going on in the agency. In fact, it shouldn't. We would want to try to protect and shield all of the activities going on. But you would have to surface a few great things to be able to talk about. And it sounds a little manipulative to do it that way, but it actually is the way of research. Because what you're doing in a research organization is creating a context or an environment where a lot of good things can happen, but hopefully some amazingly great, small number of great things can happen. So those conditions, the environment, the vibe, the set of people and their mindsets, all of that environment, somehow you just want it to be just so that someone has that eureka moment that really changes the world. So with Steve Ballmer, I used to try to, first of all, talk about all the those 4 quadrants. Of course, Steve would latch onto the mission-focused one. Tell me more about that, tell me more about that. But the reason I showed that the cocktail party conversation thing is I would explain how that Connect device would never have happened without the earlier bioengineering research work. So you tell those stories, but then you also pick just the 1 or 2 things from each part of the diagram. We're living in an era where we are, as thinkers, recasting everything that we know, all of human knowledge, in computational terms. And so that is something, that's a process that hasn't completed, but inevitably will be completed. I don't know how long that will take, but there will be, I think, a complete rewrite of human knowledge in those computational terms. And maybe in the future there'll be something else. I don't know if I'll live that long, but at least in my lifetime, it's that. And so it's not so much about interdisciplinarity, but about that rewriting process, our remaking of our understanding of human knowledge. And of course, saying interdisciplinary helps on your various proposals and so on, so use the words. But again, what we're really doing is advancing a more fundamental idea about how we, as thinkers, understand the universe around us. And I think computing and information systems is really, for our lifetimes, is really the way.